we're in the National Capital Presbytery. We're blessed to be in the sort of Washington, D.C. area. We have a number of people who work for the government or government contractors. So they've been able to work from home. So a number of our churches have done well, but recent survey our committee did found out there were some churches struggling. So the question here is, how can you ask people to be generous when so many people are in financial distress in different places?
Yeah, well, that's a very timely and important question. I think it's one that's very much on people's minds as we're in this particular period. And as you indicated in the way you framed the question, and as I began earlier, we do have to appreciate the fact that everyone's individual financial circumstance has been affected differently through the pandemic. And so we can't just make the blanket assumption that no one in our congregations can afford to give. There are people whose ability to give has been negatively impacted, and there's people whose ability to give has actually been positively impacted. And so what I think that means is that we have to get out of the mindset of just always assuming that people can't afford to give. Because I have come to see that this idea people can't afford to give is kind of a fig leaf that people use when they don't want to ask people to give. And I know that sounds harsh, but over and over again, I see evidence of that. I saw it just recently in my own church when I proposed to our minister of Christian education that we might want to consider doing a stewardship education program for children, because I knew that many of our younger families weren't really, their stewardship wasn't quite what it needed to be. And she basically ignored that. And then a few days later, in another context, she started talking about how hard it was for families now and how they all had so much educational debt. And that may or may not have been true of the families in question, but I think that was her way of saying, oh no, we couldn't ask young families to give because you know how many young families have so much student debt. Well, we make these assumptions and it becomes an excuse to justify our reluctance to talk honestly with people about their financial situation and their giving. And so, the first lesson is don't make assumptions. And don't just not ask anybody, because there are some people who can't give. One gracious way that we can come about that is a lesson that Lovett taught me, which is to always acknowledge publicly that there are some people that we know can't afford to give. That's true during a pandemic time, and that's true during regular times too. There will always be within a congregation some people who are on hard times. And if you simply state that up front and say, we know some of you are experiencing hard times, this is not the time when you need to be, increasing your giving. We appreciate that. Don't feel like we're asking that of you. That not only graciously lets those people sort of, feel like they're not being pressured, but it sends the signal to everybody else in the congregation that this is a congregation that appreciates when people are in need, and they're going to feel better about giving because they know that the church has taken that into consideration. So that's another best practice, to just always acknowledge the fact that there are people who may not be in a situation, but it's not everybody. One thing that's really interesting, if you look at the data on how people give, people who are less off actually are more generous than people who are well off. That's proven over and over again. And that, I think, is something we need to ponder prayerfully. And because when we always think that people can't afford to give, and so we're afraid to talk with them about giving, that assumes that if people had more, they would give more. But that's not what research suggests. People don't automatically give more just because they have more, and people who have less don't automatically give less. One of the kind of countercultural messages of the Christian faith is that God wants everyone, rich, poor, young, old, everyone to experience the joy of giving. And so that doesn't mean we lean on the people who can least afford it. But but I think we have to be inclusive in the way that we talk about giving and appreciate the fact that even people of modest means often find ways to be quite generous, and we don't want to take that opportunity away from them. And so, I think we just, I want to go back to what I said at the very beginning. We need, this is a time when we really need to learn the circumstances of people in our congregation. It's not just to increase their giving, but it's really to understand their needs. I mean, if there are people in your congregation who are going through severe financial distress, you want to know that, not for the context of your commitment campaign. You want to know that because the congregation needs to be able to help those people in this time. And so this is a time for really paying attention, really trying to learn what's going on in terms of people's circumstances. And first for pastoral reasons, but then also so that we can be responsible in how we talk about giving with those people. So I think my big message would be, I think the mistake that some churches have made has just been pull back entirely. This is a bad time. We can't possibly talk to anybody about giving. That kind of knee-jerk, one-size-fits-all approach to this is just not correct by so many measures. And so we need to be paying attention. We need to be acknowledging that there are people who can't give, but we also have to make sure that the invitation is there to those who are able or motivated to want to continue to give.